I would say that the most difficult part of arranging this particular episode was figuring out the Akashic records, because when we were chatting about them before we began with our wonderful guest Jay, we discovered that we had like 15 suggestions each, and then Jay had about like 30. And so we thought maybe we could do like a playlist that's just Jinn inspired or adjacent or relevant music. And perhaps that will manifest indeed between a Star Night Dwell and the Frightful Howls. But we'll all in good time, I'm sure. For now,
Oh
though,
shit.
you'll definitely get a deluge of song recommendations at the end of the episode if you stick around.
Frightful Howl's Star Night Dwell collab on the Djinn playlist. I
Let's do
wouldn't
it.
have it any other way.
Let's make it happen.
Definitely, definitely, because we were over here recommending Tamara Abu Ghazaleh. We were recommending various different records of Khnawa music that was, recorded in different anthologies. We were recommending anything ranging from Morocco to Saudi Arabia and even either north into Iran. It was a whole fiasco to decide what would most appropriately represent as diverse a tradition as we will be discussing in today's episode.
Yeah, I think talking about music and the Djinn is appropriate because these are spirits who are thought to inspire music and poetry. So I don't think it's necessary to have it be limited to songs that reference them
Mhm.
only or anything like that. A one that I brought up, which is probably the most famous Arabic pop song of all time, is Amar Diab's Nur Al Ain, which to me feels like such a Jinn song. Something about, the beloved with the shining eyes. There's just something there that just has that little like spark of sihr to it. So I threw in Omar Farouk Tekbilek, the Sultan of the Heart, for some more Sufi oriented trance music, which has that kind of feel to it as well as Najat al-Saghir as Ana Bashar al-Bahar, which has such a like a genie feel to it in its repetition of this melody that just snakes its way through the song, as it like a river working its way to the ocean.
Mhm.
Absolutely beautiful. And all this and more coming at the end, but for now, let's head on in and dive into the world of the Jinn.
Be not alarmed by the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Sfinga,
Yo.
Salt,
Yo,
and Baratea Key with our illustrious guest, J.M. Hamade, who we are very, very happy to have on the show today to talk all things Jinn and their sorcery.
Bismillah. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well that's listening. I'm excited to talk about this ever so elusive topic with such an esteemed group and such a fun group. We've been having a lot of good chats and times even before we hit record. And I love coming in and having conversations like this after loosening up a little bit, sans alcohol and intoxications, purely just through conversations and friendship. So thank you for having me.
It's our great pleasure to have you on. You're a great friend to all of us and a huge source of inspiration. And just, we love your podcast. We love your work. We've been following you. I think one of the last gifts I actually gave Salt before he moved to live with me all the way across the ocean from the UK was your particular book. It was the Shams that you put out with Revelor Press, and I bought it at Watkins the bookstore right there in England and gave it to him. And it was it feels like it's come full circle because I've been wanting to have you on since we first pitched the idea of the podcast together. And I'm so glad that it's on this topic. We brought up similarities between the fair folk and Djinn in the episode with Rose just a couple episodes ago. So it feels really great to kind of revisit this topic from another angle now of the mysterious entire categories of beings that are amorphous and difficult to define, yet have such a sway on culture, on art, on music, and inspire and terrify all the same vast majorities of peoples, and including in diasporic regions where even where I'm from, I've heard tales of the Djinn being masterfully, used to strike terror and amusement and excitement in the hearts of many. I'm so glad to be able to talk about this with you today, and I'm really grateful for all the wisdom and stories that you share with us. It's a great pleasure and inspiration always.
Thank you for all the wisdom and stories you share on your podcast and for having me on. This podcast is such a great resource for people who want to learn more about lore of all kinds from so many parts of the world, and it's in depth too. You're not just reading Wikipedia pages about it. So that's greatly appreciated and much needed. It was that episode that you did with Rose that motivated me to want to reach out to Sfinga and be like, we should do an episode on the Djinn, following up on that. And you mentioned them in that episode as well. And yeah, just it felt appropriate. So thank you for having me.
Of course. And thank you so much for everyone who listens to the podcast and supports it. Please keep following us on twitter.com/Frightful Howls, and check out our Patreon, patreon.com/The Frightful Howls. Salt's Amazing Almanac. Check out our bonus episodes every month. There's a new one at the end of the month, which is the Q&A inspired and curated by you. Our book club also at the end of the month, and plenty of extras such as the show notes and all sorts of opportunities in our community. We really appreciate each and every one of you. And if you have a chance, do give us a rate, a like, whatever it is that you have available on iTunes and Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us fight the notoriously pernicious demiurge of the algorithm and get our work out there. And without further ado, I'll hand it off to you, Jay. I was so happy that you pitched this episode to us. Can you give us a little bit of insight into why Djinn and what that is for you?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background on me to the listeners, I go by JM as well, but mostly just Jay Hamade. And I mostly focus on astrology in my day to day, but studying Arabic, Islamic magic, as well as art and things pertaining to the Jinn. These tend to be the, I guess, specializations, for lack of a better term. I was, as Sfinga already mentioned, a part of co-authoring the first English translation, really, of the Shams al-Ma'arif. There have been little, bits of it translated, and of course, this is not the full translation because the book is not singular in itself, and it is quite vast. But there will be more translations. I co-authored it with Dr. Amina Enlows, who is a PhD in Islamic studies and did really 99% of the translation. But I was a part of translating certain parts, astrology parts, some of the more like mystical ideas and magical bits in it, as well as writing an introduction to it, editing it heavily, as well as adding my own illustrations, as I am also a practicing artist. And we have a lot of pride in the release, which is through Revelor Press. And there are Jinn in that text. And when I guess people, at least in the Muslim world, think of Jinn and the use of Jinn for magical applications, they will typically think of a text like the Shams al-Ma'arif. So this is part of my background, and I guess why I'm on this podcast speaking to these things, why I have an interest in these sorts of things. I was raised Muslim. I am Lebanese on my father's side, and so there's a cultural element for me as well. And it's been something that I have been interested in since I was a little kid, when my father would read Alf Layla wa Layla, or The 1001 Nights, to me as a child, which is fairly common for Muslim kids, Arabic speaking families, this sort of thing. And these stories are filled with stories about the jinn. And there's been much scholarship over the years, and I've learned a lot about these things. Many of the stories that were read to me when I was a child, including the ones pertaining to Aladdin, for example, the ones that have become even more popular in the West. I've later learned that these are more recent accretions to the corpus that is the Thousand One Nights and the folklore there. And in re-examining many of those, which I'm excited to teach a class on the magic of the Thousand One Nights for the Salem Witchcraft and Folklore Festival in March. Many of these stories, the older layer going back to in the 12th, 11th century, and even before that, which many of these can be found in the Hadawi translation of the Thousand One Nights in particular. When you read them, they have a marrow level quality to them that some of these more recent accretions just don't seem to have. And I would include the Jinn stories as a being part of that deeper level of the stories. So there's a strong connection to things that we're raised on, culturally speaking, and that are told to us not even necessarily to scare us as it's oftentimes encountered, but purely from the realm of just storytelling. So this is my background, and where a lot of my interests began with this, as well as more recently seeing how these things connect to things like art making, poetry, music, as I mentioned. I can go on and on. So if anyone has anything to say, but I think next I can also introduce a little bit more about, who they are and what they are and this sort of thing.
I could listen to you talk forever, Jay, so absolutely no worries there.
Likewise.
Oh, thank you. So that's a bit about my background. For the jinn themselves, it's a vast, vast topic. And I'm glad that I have the fairy episode to sort of piggyback on, because you set a good precedent on your podcast with that episode, and you talked about many of the crossovers with the jinn, and they are remarkably similar in their habits, in their taboos, all of these sorts of things. So I'm sure that's something that will come up throughout the conversation. I encourage all those who haven't listened to that to go back, and you can also get a lot of context by the jinn through listening to that conversation as well. But jinn as a term is a term which essentially just means invisible or not seen. The root of the word in the jim and the noon in particular are found in words that connote not always sacrality, but invisibility primarily. These are found in words like Jannah, which means heaven, for example. So words that oftentimes have this jim and noon combination refer to things of the invisible world, or alam al ghaib being the invisible or the unseen. And so this is not only the world of the jinn, but they partake of this in this way. So as a term in itself, it is referring to essentially just invisible beings. And this is important because in Islam, or in Orthodox Islam, there are humans, there are angels, there are jinn, and then there is Allah. And this is essentially it. When it comes to specific cultures that have Islamic overlays, you can sometimes see a distinction between the dead and the jinn, but it's rare. It's very, very rare. And it's something that's found pretty deeply in particular cultures, because in Islamic orthodoxy, there is a sort of notion that the dead, they do not speak and are not heard after they pass away. And if you hear a dead person or have an experience with a dead person, that actually this is a jinn that you are experiencing. And so, people in a spiritualist seance, all these kinds of contexts that we in the West think of as spiritual encounters with dead people, from a traditional Muslim context, this would be considered to be an encounter with the jinn. So this is an important distinction, which once again gets into Islamic orthodoxy, but there's some wiggle room there. So the last thing that I will say is that most people, when referring to the jinn in the Muslim context, they're referring to the jinn as they're spoken of in the Quran in particular. So there's three surahs that they're, I would say, most prominently spoken about, even though you'll get the jinn throughout the Quran. That's Surah 15, Al-Hijr, where the jinn are referred to as the Nar Samum, which is different than the smokeless fire. The Nar Samum is the poison fire, Samum being a sin and meme root, which references to poison, which is also where you get the angel Samsamael, who is thought to be related to Mars. So this is like a hot wind version of the jinn, which is sometimes considered distinct from the smokeless fire, which you get in Surah 55, which is Ar-Rahman. Here, this is the jinn referred to as smokeless fire in particular. And then, of course, the most important part of the Quran having to do with the jinn is Surah Al-Jinn, which is 72. And here, this is where you get this famous story of the jinn who used to eavesdrop on the upper reaches of the heavens. And with the coming of the Quran and the revelation through the angel Jibril, shooting stars began to hit their bodies, and they were deterred from being able to eavesdrop on what is happening in the upper heavens, which, I think is a reference to astrology in many respects. And through hearing, they're wondering why they can no longer hear what's happening in the upper heavens. And it is Muhammad, peace be upon him, his recitation of the Quran and the coming of the Quran, which then they realize is why they can no longer hear this change that has fundamentally happened. I think that's a good introduction, at least to the jinn at the Muslim level of it.
I love that so much. I love the notion of the astrological break happening there with Revelation. Oftentimes you hear in monotheistic traditions stemming from the original sort of Abrahamic impulses, right? This idea of a stamp or a seal on history, right? Like once there is this particular event, time has changed, and time has changed in this irrevocable way, right? So for example, the death of Christ or the birth of Christ as well, right? There's this notion that even our calendar dates that we use in the West are based on this event, right? Or the revelation of the Quran is something that is now a seal upon prophetdom itself, right? There are no more prophets after Muhammad, peace be upon him. And so you have this interesting notion of what does that mean for astrology? What does that mean for divination or augury or seership? What does that mean for communication between the divine and other layers of beings, including angels and jinn? Your point about the dead, I think, is really fascinating to me because something that I've seen, and of course the Balkans has had an enormous influence from the Ottoman conquering, we have a tremendous amount of influence from the Turkish sort of cultural background, especially with large parts of the Balkans being predominantly Muslim. And one of the things that I've noticed with that, especially speaking to practitioners from Bosnia who are Muslim, is the completely different orientation around necromancy. So rituals that are identical in nature and practice and how they are carried out, let's say that I've learned to appease the dead, or things I've learned to attribute to the dead and to ancestors and disturbances from them, especially when they're considered to be coming back in forms like a vampiri, as vampires, as restless dead, and so on. Speaking with a friend who is Muslim, who's been like, well, to me, this would be jinn, and I would address it in these ways, and this is how I would go about the exorcism, and this is how I would go about ameliorating this problem for this family, and this is what we would do in the bathroom versus the backyard, and so on. Here's the talismans we would put around, and the word squares, and so on. And I found that exceptionally just interesting because even certain classes of spirits that I'm very familiar with and work intimately with through the lineage that I've been granted initiation in, as well as in what I've received directly from spirit, that my mentors have helped me cultivate. This friend of mine is always like, yes, I buy that completely. This all sounds great. And I see those all as jinn. And this has been something really fun. I think one of the first conversations you and I had, Jay, in person when we met was about this, was just the idea that like all of these spirits get sublimated as category. And that's normal for every tradition that involves syncretism, right? right? I mean, all these spirits were pre-Christian, and then Orthodox Christianity comes in, and now we see them as friends of saints or allies to angels, and we see them as existing in this Christian hierarchy of beings, but they still retain some of their original forms. And that's absolutely true for Jinn as well in terms of pre-Islamic conceptions of these beings.
Exactly. Which is why it's hard to talk about them, right? Because you're talking about such a huge category, which would include the dead, which would include, as you said, spirits, both malefic and benefic of all kind. Um, but even within the larger, like Muslim context, there are subcategories. In the Quran, for example, there's a difference between the jinn, who, you talked about this on the fairy episode, who many of them are Muslim. There are believer jinn, and many of them are Christian, and many are Jewish, and many are, non-believers or pagans, or whatever word you want to use for it. One of the main distinctions is between the jinn, who, the Quran and the Abrahamic traditions were brought to and that they practice, and the shayateen, who are, essentially demons or devils in this way. And their parentage, sometimes, scholars have gone back and forth on the parentage of jinn. Some would say that Iblis, who is the Lucifer figure of the Quran and of Arabic culture, is the parent of all jinn. Some would say that he is just the parent of the shayateen, or of the many satans. um, but so this is something that goes back and forth, as well as even to Iblis's lineage himself. Scholars have debated for many hundreds of years whether Iblis is an angel or a jinn. Most say that he is on the side of a jinn, but that's still a debate that has been had, and is probably still being had somewhere. So there's the difference between the more demonic or malefic jinn, shayateen, and then just jinn as a very large group of spiritual beings that are not angels and not humans, for one. And then, going from there, there's so many more found in folklore itself, as well as in more sub-Saharan and North African based spirit possession practices. Their categories of jinn, which, look something more like what you might encounter in, various Afro diaspora practices and things in Brazil and the Caribbean and whatnot. And they use these as well. So sometimes those are color based. You get categories of jinn based on region, which, something that was brought up in the fairy episode is using the term fairy or jinn, right? And how this isn't necessarily something with these kinds of spirits that one wants to do. What I have noticed is having like a taboo around saying that name too much. I mean, you don't see it as often within the diaspora, I would say, or people, Muslims who live in the United States, in the West. You hear them using the term jinn, although, I'm sure they would be reticent to overuse that term. But I would say it's probably more common to refer to them in other ways, not in the diaspora. And some of the ways that this is done is through referring to them as the people from over there. And over there can be it's some other place. And usually it's some place that has an elemental connection of some kind. So one example is the jinn are sometimes referred to as the Ahl al-Ard, or the people of the earth. Ahl being the people, and then of this place. So you could also get the Ahl al-Bahar, or the people of the ocean, but this could also be a reference just to the water people themselves. So just a way of not saying the term jinn could be, the people from over there. But there are, a variety of other classes of jinn that people might have heard even through pop culture, like the Ifrit, for example, well known for moving the throne of the Queen of Sheba, or Bilqis, in the Quran itself, in the blink of an eye. There's the Marid, who are oftentimes associated with this story that I mentioned in Surat al-Jinn, with, listening to the upper heavens. There are the Hin. There's the Qareen, of course, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in the Qarina. There's the Ghul and a like jinn called the Silat. There's the Nas. There's the Amr, or the resident jinn. So just like, many cultures have their trolls and gnomes and their various sorts of spirits, this is also common for jinn. But my experience has been the varieties of them are you don't hear them as often in the diaspora Muslim culture. It tends to just be referred to as jinn, or genie, which is individual, or jinia, which is the individual female jinn.
Yeah, that's something that has always struck me as particularly evocative. And my own background is seeing spirit, like I said, spirits that I would call, okay, this is a dragon, and then friends being like, oh, that's like a jinn that comes from the sky or comes from the stars or is born of lightning. And then similarly, spirits that I consider especially chthonic, that are devils that lurk in trash heaps and crossroads and broken down railway stations and all these other kinds of things, and people that I know who are of a Muslim background saying, oh, these are very similar, if not the same, or are miscategorized as shayateen, and going insofar as sharing taboos, right? So one thing that I find that, much like fairy, these categories are exceptionally flexible and porous and can refer to places where spirits come from, shared lineage or adherence to taboos, and at the same time all being exceptionally diverse and kind of like naturally resisting certain kinds of categorizations. Or even just in some cases, it's just like magical race, and it's hard to pin down more than that. And I think necessarily so. Categories and these kinds of taxonomies are, after all, something that we want to impose upon the spirit world to make it more comfortable and understandable to us and legible. And yet, spirits, many of them, as soon as they feel like you understand them to a certain degree, they punish you for your arrogance by changing themselves and being like, well, no, I'm different now. I've exceeded beyond your grasp. And I think there's something about, whether it's the Fae or whether it's the Jinn or any kind of spirit, that they necessarily will always be a little bit further away. Much like ways that we pay respect to wolves and bears by referring to them as like the brown one, or the one from above, the one from that mountain, the one from up high, the strong one. We don't want to say their name to call them to us. Getting their attention, I think, is also something that people, on the one hand, both court and avoid for different reasons. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit to sort of the understandings of taboos around these beings and how they are considered in different cultural expressions as you've understood and encountered them.
Well, to that really, really important point, I come up against this notion of smokeless fire, which is, if you're staying strictly Quranic, which we're not, I'm not, you would sort of stay with that, right? You'd be like, okay, these are beings of fire in this way. But we know this is not the case, and that they're far more complex than that. And just associating them with fire is, I don't think enough. I do want to reference an article that I wrote which speaks to exactly this, called Notes on the Infernalization of the Jinn, Terrestrial Underpinnings, and Hopefully a Breath of Fresh Air. um, where I was responding to an academic article called The Infernalization of the Jinn, essentially where they were moved from the aerial dimension, or even from their multi-dimensionality or their multi-categorality. Is that even a word?
Is
To
now.
just being the people of the underworld, or to being, denizens of hell in this way, which is also an effective language, right? And we see how, our language also interpenetrates with al-ghaib and the invisible world. Yeah, I come up against it, and jinn are also known to oftentimes occupy, watery places, and to be actually quite fond of water. And some more are aerial in this way, and as you said, some are more even celestial. So there is this great diversity there, and plurality, which is, of course, rarely acknowledged by orthodoxy of any kind. But I think if you were going to stay with that, you could say that, the notion of smokeless fire is something which many have said is thing akin to energy, right? Or yeah, invisible movements of energy, as opposed to us humans who are, or partially humans who are made of clay. Taboo wise, this is really going to vary by culture. Although I do think it's interesting how many tend to be shared with with fairy taboos and the like. There is a notion of salt being taboo. There is a notion sometimes of iron being taboo. In relation to food, for your average Muslim, you are to say Bismillah with your food, with your meal, as you move through thresholds, this sort of thing, which the interplay between what is taboo and what is like the beginnings of taboo happen with our speech, with our prayer, with the way we hold ourselves daily. Things related to that are also keeping up with prayer and being closer to God tends to keep the jinn away, at least in a more orthodox understanding. And I would say, by and large, that at least for your average Muslim, that the jinn are taboo in themselves. They are a representation of taboo and of other, capital O, other in this way. Anything beyond sort of keeping them at a distance with the acknowledgement that they are very much real, because to be a Muslim is to acknowledge the full reality of the jinn, in the sense that they are just as real as you and I are. Anything beyond that tends to be more cultural. And the variety you can speak to, the difference between Bosnia and Eastern Europe, and then moving into Turkey, then moving into North Africa, and then moving into some places where like Saudi Arabia, for example, where essentially everything would be taboo related to them. So you get a vast array of what is considered to be taboo and what is not, depending on where you are. I would say that things tend to be, at least this is the stereotype, and I think at some level it's true, things tend to be a little bit more lax in North Africa, in Morocco in particular, when it comes to these things, just because it's so much embedded in the culture even before Islam, and the way that that culture has intermixed with Islam, or at least the indigenous culture has intermixed with Islam, as well as sub-Saharan Africa and West African influences. It's sort of just left an environment that is a little bit more friendly, I would say, to the jinn. And then the more you go, the closer you go to Mecca and Medina, to the hub of Islam proper, the more they are taboo with essentially everything. When it comes to ceremonial magicians, and this is a distinction which I'm sure we'll talk more about, ceremonial magicians, or more grimoire magic and their handling of the jinn, you get pretty, I don't want to say universal, but consistent purity, ritual purity notions, like fasting, praying for 7 days at the very least. Sometimes it's even more, 40 days. These very, very extensive rituals that involve going out into mostly wild spaces, fasting extensively, praying extensively, to be able to have a vision and to typically make a pact with a particular jinn. And these are the kinds of things that you find in Arabic books of magic. And these are extremely intensive procedures that involve, I mean, most people living in the modern world are not able to really do these sorts of things. But the ritual magic aspect of it tends to have this sort of purity taboo around it. When you get to more possession-based traditions, which you find more commonly in on the African continent, in North Africa and Ethiopia and Sudan, but you get some of this in southern Iran and in the Middle East as well. You get more common things like cleanliness, right? If you are not remaining clean through having sex, through just even not bathing as often as you should be, spending too much time around bathrooms or places with, drains that go down into the underworld, as well as, throwing out hot boiling water out your front door, or, down a drain, and not notifying the jinn that you're doing so, as well as, not covering your mouth even before you yawn. All of these sorts of things, even going for an extended period of time and not being married, right, is another thing, another purity taboo that could get you a jinn throughout the world, but in particular to those regions. So it's pretty vast, I would say, the differences between them.
I wanted to, as part of this episode, delve into orthodox understandings of here is how we do this versus more, shall we say, folkloric understandings of, well, these are where these spirits already are, So let's go there and encounter them in this organic way.
Yeah, there's so many strange cultural and geographical distinctions with all of that, and I mean I find it endlessly fascinating in my studies, and I'm giving you a very vast range of my studies right now. One book, for example, and yeah, I can name off some more books at the end that I've found to be good and influential. But Barbara Driskin's Living with the Djinn, I think it's called, where she is studying Czar in person in Egypt, in Cairo. And so this is North Africa, right? And so when I say North Africa, this is not homogeneous either. Morocco will be very different than Egypt, will be very different than Libya, very different than Tunis. So we're talking about a vast range of diverse traditions, but there are things that sort of unite them and some consistent things. But I like Driskin's book because it talks about some of what you mentioned, like Zod practices of feeding pipes in homes, in the bathroom, for example, with animal sacrifice. This is something that we see once again in various Afro-diasporic traditions. And this kind of like living, the name of the book is Living with the Djinn, right? And I think that's really the primary difference. It's these people who, my studies have gone more in this direction, because it's a more holistic view on what it is to be around these beings, and these beings are everywhere. I haven't really talked about where they're known to be, but stereotypically it's like places without humans, but really, they are everywhere, even in hustling and bustling cities. And people, oftentimes very, religious and people you wouldn't expect to become possessed do become possessed in large cities, not necessarily walking around in ruins or in graveyards or in places where they're, known to haunt. So I personally find, and I'm more interested in studying this, living with them, living alongside them, and what this is, and the kinds of practices that emphasize, like, well, what it is to offer sacrifice to the Amir Jinn who already reside in a home before you even build it, or are in the home before you move into it, and what it is to, appease these beings with prayer and sacrifice and whatnot. So I think Svinga might have some things to say about that, but yeah, it's an important distinction, and maybe we could talk more about it because I think it's super, super important.
Yeah, even just the way that they can become part of everyday family life through marriage, for example, or there's a very famous anthropological work by Vincent Capanzano, Tuhami, Portrait of a Moroccan, that looks into a man who is married to Aisha Kandisha, who is variously understood potentially as a genie, can be understood in other ways, as a she-devil and so on, that has an interesting history as a potential countess who was seducing Portuguese soldiers and allowing them to essentially fall into traps by Moroccan soldiers who would come in and kill them. But it's one of those things of like, what does it mean when the spirit is acknowledged as an integral part of the home versus what happens when a violation of the most sacred taboo is what calls them in through, for example, stories in let's say in Bosnia, for example, that I'm privy to of how to become a sihirbaz or a sihirbazica. So this is sihir, right, being a word for magic, right? But also baz or bazica is male, female, like someone who throws. So someone who throws sorcery or witchcraft. The way to become a witch in this form is to blaspheme the Quran at a crossroads and marry Iblis. And the marriage here can mean marrying one of his daughters who are considered to be Jinniyah themselves, or it can also be different kinds of Javali, for example, meaning devils, depending on the dialect that you're speaking. And that is like an extreme case of like taboo breaking. But then you also have people who are just understand that like, well, your house is your house, let's say, but as soon as you leave your house, everything else in the world belongs to other spirits. And it's understood that various invisible beings live in completely other parts of the world, and that's why you refer to them sometimes as the beings from over there. And you have to be careful and have respect and say, I'm entering their home, so I need to say, make an ablution or make an offering or say a prayer just to acknowledge, I know you're out there, and I don't necessarily want to interact with you right now, but I am giving you the credit that you're due, that you're the lord of this place. So I think that animistic mindset is exceptionally important, in keeping in mind that taboos aren't just about like a matter of being fearful of superstitions. It's encoded cultural understandings of politeness and of etiquette around certain beings. Like we talked in, it's interesting, you mentioned throwing the hot water out the front door, and we, in the episode with Rose, where we talked about the fair folk, we mentioned, not throwing your dirty water out the window. And of course, it's good things to do in general when humans are passing by, but there may be many invisible people that pass by. And much like the fair folk, Djinn are not necessarily always immaterial. They can be physical completely, but also invisible. They can choose to make themselves invisible to everyone except one person who is anointed in a certain way, or the person that they are bound to, if there's a familiar like relationship. But even then, people who get into, at least I've noticed, who are very excited about manuscripts that involve, here's a list of Djinn names and here's how to conjure them, or using the Beretia, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit, in terms of like a long prayer that can conjure technically a vast majority of spirits. They get very excited to go about it in this very ceremonial way, but it neglects the completely organic way in which you can encounter these spirits quite literally in the wild. There's a podcast called The Hidden Djinn by Our Heart Podcasts and Gurman Mile that goes into quite a lot of lore about different ways people encounter Djinn in day to day, including as your roommate, in college, because sometimes they want to go to college, or they have their own universities and court systems and worlds and societies and dialects and everything, and they influence our art and our music with ecstasy, and with these time-bending trance states in which we get a little bit swept up into one foot in our world and one foot in theirs. And that's through daydreaming, through night dreaming. These are legitimate states, and that doesn't have to be necessarily that your body's completely unconscious, but these kinds of states in which you encounter them are, it's not necessarily always just in an intentional framework of I'm fasting and I have a spirit catalog list and I'm going to do certain prayers to attract their attention. They're in the world and we share the world with them. And I think that's something that with anyone I've ever met who has wanted to share a story about the Djinn with me or talk about it from a Muslim perspective, it's always been the emphasis that on the one hand, some people are very scared and just are like, this is the ultimate taboo to work with them in my culture. I don't want to even attract their attention, which is why I don't want to speak their names. And those who have had a much more casual experience of, they're there and it's unavoidable. And it's just more a matter of finding out how to more politely cohabitate, I suppose.
Exactly. The ceremonial approach lacks what I see as so common among cultures all over the world and their spirit traditions, which if you follow, Biki mentioned Khanawa, which I did a really great episode on that everyone should check out on my podcast called Saturnian Paradigms in North Africa. But Ganawa, the Tuareg have it. There's Zar, of course. There's Bori, which is more West Africa. But all of these various spirit practices, what you don't get with the ceremonial stuff is what you get with these, which they all have a similar sort of story arc for how people end up getting involved with Djinn, which is that, as you guys, and I'm glad you talked about it on the fairy episode, mentioned, most people have really no desire to get involved with these spirits. And I just want to go on the record and say, I don't think people should be going out of their way to contact these spirits, frankly. I'll just say that. But if one is, fated in this life, let's say, in these more spirit-based traditions, the circumstances tend to unfold in this way where they will find you regardless. Unlike seeking them out in this ceremonial context, which lacks this strong cultural element, which I will sort of summarize briefly, which is that you had no intention of getting involved with these spirits, and then you found yourself with some sort of strange illness, and you typically started off going to a Western doctor or a traditional healer who might use plants and herbs, and then the Western doctor using medicine, and they don't know what's wrong with you. And then you're like, okay, maybe it's a metaphysical illness of some sort. And sometimes, the Hakim or the wise person who is skilled in Quran, this person isn't always able to help you either. And there's something even beyond that, which, Sfinga, you mentioned this notion of like, damaging Qur'ans and this sort of stuff. Like, I just want to put on the record, I'm not an advocate for any of these things. I have no doubt that they exist and that people do them. And I think that the Muslim fundamentalists tend to overemphasize this stuff in terms of forming relationship with jinn. Hence why I prefer this kind of traditional spirit possession based traditions and the way it unfolds in this way. Because when the ruqya, or the application of Quranic verses in particular, does not work to remove the condition of possession, or the condition of jinn haunting and this sort of thing, which oftentimes it is not enough. You don't hear this from the fundamentalists, but it's not always enough to do this. Then they go to the person who is, the czar. I don't want to say high priestess, but the head of a house, if you will, the person
Mhm.
who has this knowledge. They'll go to someone like this, or in a Ganawa context, they'll go to one of these events, and these people will find a way to essentially work alongside the condition and to work alongside the jinn, as opposed to endlessly attempting to exorcise them.
Absolutely. That's why I wanted to bring up the example of the kind of explicit, like diabolical pact, because as I mentioned, it's an extreme, right? And there's a reason it's part of the kind of cultural mythos of this is in situations in which there's a predominant orthodoxy that this is a bad thing to do, right? That to interact with these spirits is a negative thing, then naturally it's going to get associated with the most for like outwardly heretical acts, right? And so that's one of those things of like it is inherently dabbling with things that are contra the orthodoxy and contra the sort of religious piety. Then and unfortunately what that does is, because it's sensationalized and it's exciting and it's kind of associated with the diabolism of witchcraft, it neglects the more organic ways that this can be done in day to day, especially with what I mean, I'm no expert on Zar, but what I've read about it in anthropological sources it has always been this emphasis on community mediation, right? On community restoration and reciprocation of these effects of the illness and of the way that the ancestralized trauma can come through in these trance states, and the ways that spirits can even help bring this to the forefront so it is addressed, and in ways in which people especially get to experience sort of the power and the place of women, for example, as mediums of trance. And so that's one of those things that like it's not as sexy for someone who's not from this culture that wants like a very diabolical in your face kind of like, oh, it has to, when you read certain kinds of texts like Al-Tuki's, Red Magic, and you get all excited by like how kind of intense some of these rituals are and their intentions. But it's not all curses. It's not all, love spells that are incredibly coercive. That's not necessarily what it is. That is something that culturally is going to get very popular because of the aesthetic that it has, but it also neglects the living tradition of negotiation with spirits as part of the natural world, right? Like there's so much to folk magic that is not like the absolute most blasphemous or heretical thing that you can possibly find, right? And I think the natural way that these spirits are mediated in some of these cults is especially important for us to consider, because in some ways there's the nuance of appreciating the various grades to which these spirits can influence us and touch us, and why sometimes there's, like as you mentioned, there's no escape from it, because there's also no escape from your familial trauma at times. Like something will come through, and then if someone begins to manifest those things and it's a cluster of their own affects plus spirits, then the community can no longer ignore it or not confront it. And it doesn't mean that something was not enough because it's not pure or powerful or holy. It's just that there's other forces that must be mediated, right? I always think back to the Greek magical papyri. When you're talking to a spirit and you're calling them by various names of beings, the fact that it doesn't respond to the first 15 doesn't mean those 15 names are illegitimate or not powerful or not deities and powerful holy figures. It's just the spirit will respond to the one that it knows and the one that it obeys. So I think that's kind of a metaphor for that. It's not to say that the suras are not powerful enough to do what the function is. It's just that the person's affect and their spiritual makeup and the spirits that are currently riding them are responding to something more, and they need the attention of, let's say, a Zat healer who has the cunning and the ability to, the foresight, if you will, to divine on that and to figure out what is the next step.
I hate to oversimplify it, but I'm going to say there's two worldviews that are at work here. There is largely Abrahamic worldview, which is textual, right? Which is coming from, I would say, more of the region that we call the Middle East. And this is the book magic stuff. These are the grimoires. These are using the names of angels and of God. In when we think of ta'wiz or these little enfolded paper pieces and albuni, the Shamsu Ma'arif, right? You mentioned al-Tuki, these kinds of books. This is largely coming from an Abrahamic worldview where every fundamentalist will tell you that all of this stuff is it's blasphemous, it's kufr, but at some level it does see that God is everything, and if everything is God, then manipulating the various manifestations of God, this is how magic is done, right? Where number is a manifestation of God, these names are letters, a manifestation of God. So to rearrange them in these different ways, and we think of Arabic magic or talismans, is the underlying epistemology, let's say, for how the magic is functional. And then once again, not to oversimplify, but the other worldview that we're seeing, I would say, largely emanates from sub-Saharan Africa, West Africa, and is North Africa has a strong mixture of them, which I think is why the culture is so beautiful and in Morocco and Egypt. But this worldview, which we see in Zar, in Ghanawa, and Bouari, et cetera, is everything that we've been talking about, and I think resembles more what we see in pretty much most other parts of the world, to be frank. And it's not literary based. It's not about the passing on of knowledge through text. These are oral traditions, and these are traditions that use things like food. They use things like music. They use things like ritual possession. So I would say I think it's fair to kind of boil it down to these two worldviews and the way that they address Jinn. And I more and more I kind of have the preference for studying this worldview, which is I think a little bit more worldwide, I guess, multicultural.
Kind of similar to the literary traditions of Europe versus cunning folk practices, which obviously are intermingled, right? They have overlap. The literary does influence the folk influences the literary. They are not separate spheres of enterprise, but you do see there's a vast gulf of difference between what Rose was talking about in the fairy episode versus, let's say, the Book of Oberon, and what those practices even look like, or remotely how they're conducted, and what the attitudes and assumptions are about the practitioner in either case.
Well, I mean, yeah, when you look at the comparisons between written magical literature and like for the European case, specifically like encounter narratives with spirits, the way they go, the way everything takes place is completely different.
I would go as far to do what I just did, which is to separate them into completely different worlds. But the Venn diagram is fun and interesting, right? Like the Vesica Pisces of these worlds for sure, and the way that they're interacting with one another. I think it's similar to the transmission of European grimoires to the Caribbean, and the way that these like both indigenous and Afro diasporic traditions addressed grimoires and the way they handled them, worked them, whether it's through, obia, kimbanda, et cetera. I think there's a similar thing going on there, right? Where these worlds are converging together.
Absolutely. We've mentioned a few different texts, right? The Shams Samarif, obviously, the Berhatia, the Al-Tukis, Harut and Marut, as well as Red Magic, and so on. So there's these like pretty famous texts that involve kind of procedures of conjuring jinn. And I was kind of going over. We have a book club, and people are voting right now for the February book club on our Patreon. And so far, it's the Forbidden Grimoire of Harut and Marut that's winning. And I was thinking, I was going back through my copy of the one published by Ishtar Publishing, and I was kind of giggling to myself that, like, was it maybe 75% of it is like love spells. Um, and, and nothing for money, interestingly, right? Not a single wealth spell in the entire thing. And I was thinking about, okay, so we have this manuscript tradition, and of course this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many versions of these texts in many different places, and there's many manuscripts that, you know, probably will never see translation into English. There's even forgeries of manuscripts and people trying to sell fake manuscripts and so on various websites that I've looked into, on Egyptian forums, for example, people claiming to have like the one secret thing that is locked up in their cellar and they want to sell it on eBay and so on. So it's got its own culture for sure, much like grimoire manuscripts do in the West. But then there's also the sphere of folk tradition that is mediated through possession and through embodiment and through music and food. And I was wondering, in this discussion, what I'm kind of been thinking about a lot is, where have you noticed in both of these contexts, or maybe more in the context that you're interested especially in studying, where is the Karin? Because this is something that pops up a lot, right? This kind of double, or this particular spirit that is a kind of Satan, almost in the sense that, of the biblical sense of like someone who is judging and accusing, but also tempting, and then at the same time like a helper. I've just, from talking to many different people, I've heard so many different attempts to articulate this notion from like the most pernicious possible, that these are spirits to avoid and to master, almost like a thwarting angel type situation that you have to have with them, where you become the thwarting angel that subjugates them and is like puts them out, versus very symbiotic relationships of familiarship. So I'm curious as to where that has come up for you.
There's just as much diversity in that respect as well. I think I saw y'all mention Dunya Rasik's upcoming book. It's on pre-order right now.
Yeah, it's Dunya Rashic's Bedeviled Jinn Doppelgangers in Islam,
Yeah.
Bari and Sufism.
So everyone, that's going to be a good one when that comes out. So definitely check that out because that's speaking to Ibn Arabi in particular, and his notion of the Qarin. But I would say that in the traditions that we've been talking about, you tend to find more in the African continent, more possession-based traditions. The Qarin would be sort of like what you see in Orisha traditions or in Vodou, be the equivalent of a head spirit,
Mm.
right? There's a variety of spirits that are to be found in this tradition, and the one that is the most like you, and I don't think that they would use the word Karin. In fact, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't. But I would say that this is the equivalent. And in that sense, the Karin is, as you said, Svinga, a sort of a double who shares a likeness with you, and in that way, there, at least traditionally in Islam, there's a feedback loop between the person and the Qarin. So in the more Abrahamic context, in this other worldview, the Qarin has a lot of similarities to things you might see in Greco-Roman thought of the genius, right? Or even certain things related to the holy guardian angel. I'm not saying it's exactly that, but there's similarities there. But in particular in Islam, there's this notion that, which I guess is not exclusive to Islam, but the better the person is, the more righteous they are in their behavior, the more religious they are, the closer they are to Allah, the more the Quran is going to be like that, and then vice versa. Of course, the more criminal and debauched behavior that they participate in, the Quran will become more like a personal shayateen. So the twinning is real with that, right? This is the spirit that you are thought to come into this world with. This is an inherent part of your being. And this is something that at every stature of society, everyone is thought to have of a Qarin or a spirit double. But as a religious person, it is on you to make your Qarin more of a better Muslim, let's say. There are in these same books of magic, there are oftentimes rituals to invoke the Qarin, to be able to communicate with the Qarin directly. This is something that you see fairly commonly, and that could be through a variety of things, including the recitation of Quranic verses and certain Arabic letters, as well as barbarous, or what are called barbarous names. And so this is I guess like if one were to evoke their doppelganger, their shadow beings, something like this. And in many ways, this would be to achieve certain ends, to evoke your Qareen as a helper, as the jinn who is closest to you before you would evoke jinn who are less familiar to you, right? This is a bridge to other jinn if you are on that kind of magical path.
I love that so much. It's always with the relationality of folk practice, right? Who are you to call me? Well, like maybe there's a middleman who understands like the familiars of the sorcerer or the witch who are able to vouch on behalf of their incarnated partner and bring them other pacts, and which helps accrue and congeal other kinds of spirit hierarchies to them. It makes a lot of sense that you would want to have someone on the inside, as it were. It's also interesting how dissonance between the person and the Qareen, if they're completely at odds, let's say the person is, you mentioned one way in which one individual's conduct and character and piety and religiosity mirrors that of their Qareen. There's also situations that I've heard just from friends who've been like, actually, the Qareen is trying to either bring you closer to Allah, and if you are not on that path, symptoms of possession can occur because the Qareen cannot protect you from other things worming in. They are not like in sync with you, so because you're so far away from your destiny, yeah, the other spirits are now able to influence you because they're not there as that first line of protection. And then others who say the opposite, that the Qareen is constantly tempting you, actually. It reminds me a little bit of Socrates' daemon, of course, famously articulated in the dialogues of Plato, and also of just various understandings of the personal assistant who is there first to, in many ways, as we've seen in the PGM, the daimon is trying to help get you closer to the divine and to elevate you above others in this hierarchy of beings as having a closer relationship to the residents of divine beings. And if you're in a good relationship with them, even through the act of conjuring them and maintaining a strong relationship with them, then naturally other kinds of conjurations will follow more easily. But at the same time, a dissonance between the individual and this double or this spirit guardian can bring you even more into your divination not working because you're so lost, because you are out of touch with the first and most immediately intimate companion that you could really have.
Well, to make it even more confusing, sometimes there are spirits, like one, for example, just called Karina, who is sort of like her own Jinniyah, isn't necessarily the Qareen, but has pretty much the same name as the Qareen. So that name just gets used for other jinn as well, who are not at the personal level with one. And then there's also a mix up because you have this notion in Islam of, two angels who are recording your good deeds and your bad deeds, one on the right side and one on the left side. So oftentimes this is recounted in the grave. It's thought that, when one dies, this is recounted actually in the grave in the barzakh. So these things get mixed up sometimes too through translation, right? Through even in the transmission of texts. So it's not a cut and dry thing in that way.
Absolutely. But that's one thing, back to the conversation about taxonomy, right? Is like we impose these categories, and then cultural transmission will inherently, and this is not a bad thing, but will inherently muddy them with different, even with just with idioms or with rhyme or with similar words and the way that they sound and how these sounds now attribute new qualities to old names that had their own tradition. The various names for, let's say, dragons and fairies and vampires in Eastern Europe, you have people who speak dialects of these languages arguing with each other all the time over, well, you're using this word improperly without realizing that it's taken on its own character. A word that I might use to refer to a celestial dragon that has a benevolent relationship with humanity. In other parts, its cognate is used to refer to a more negative and pernicious being. And that doesn't mean that I or they are wrong. It's just the language has evolved this way, and the dialects are going to do their own thing. And similarly, spirit forms recognized as having similar qualities but behaving in different ways. You'll have many charms in Bulgaria to purge yourself of unwanted dragon marriages, for example, because they relate these spirits to be more like what I would call Najdaya. But they use a word that's a bit more closer to Zmai, Zmi or Zmei, to refer to them. So it's one of those things that I think is essential to not be frustrated with, but just to kind of explore with open-eyed curiosity as to the way that these things can manifest. As soon as we want there to be, again, a definition or something that is consistent, culture will not let you have that, and transmission will not let you have that. The spirits will definitely not let you have that.
For sure. And that's why I keep coming back to language and how important it is with this, because one of the ways that the jinn are oftentimes referred to is as ruh, which is wind and also breath. And so there is an intimate connection with word and with speech as well, and the power of speech in this way. And so I think the language that gets used is important. And like you said, Svinga, it's malleable. It's not a one way or the only way or anything like that. I would say that, it even goes beyond, and this is where the lines get blurred between like Arabic magic and the jinn, right? Like many of these cultures that have Islam, they know Arabic through the Quran and through prayer, but they don't speak Arabic as a part of their culture, right? And so, the jinn for them are not tied to the Arabic language inherently. So they're going to have other names, and they're going to have other correspondences.
100%. Actually, since we've mentioned Zar and Khnawa a few times already, maybe you could speak a little bit about those traditions or what you found compelling in your investigations of them, especially for listeners who've never heard of these terms. We've mentioned Khnawa in Morocco, right, and Zar in Egypt. Whichever one you feel like tackling first, what particularly, if you can give us some background as to what these traditions are generally. I know we're speaking in huge broad strokes, but just kind of like what can people understand the context behind these discussions, and where the jinn come in?
Yeah, so I had my little brief summary earlier, but essentially these are possession-based traditions, which in my little way of organizing things, say that this belongs more to this larger cultural worldview that exists outside of the Abrahamic context, where people acknowledge this living side by side with the jinn, with spiritual beings, in a way that you don't get with the other context. And so the through line is, I would say, the nature of the spirits themselves, which tend to pop up with quite a bit of similarity along these different traditions from West Africa all the way to southern Iran, as well as the possession and music based practices around them. Say that these are the consistent things that you can find, which align these different practices. So take, for example, Ghanawa, which is you find in Morocco. I don't have the time to get into all of the specifics of it, but these traditions are oftentimes related to the history of slavery in these different countries, in the same way that possession-based traditions in the Caribbean and the Afro diaspora are based through the histories of slaves being taken and brought to the Caribbean. And this is no different even on the continent of Africa. So Ghanawa in Morocco is related to, very much so, to a history of slavery in that part of the world. And it's similar in Sudan, and it's similar in many other places, in particular to the enslavement of Black people. And so, as a part of the movement, the forced movement of these people, typically further north into North Africa and into the Middle East, there is a bringing of, let's say, these spiritual technologies, which involve music more than anything else, and then possession as an extension of this music. So this is what Ghanawa is, Bori, which is further south of Morocco, more in Nigeria. So this is, on the western side, going all the way to Zar, which tends to be most prominent. You see it in Egypt, Sudan, and Ethiopia, I would say, are the core of Zar. Many saying that Zar comes from Ethiopia, and many saying Sudan. And then, you just cross the sea right there, and you're in Yemen. You're in, the traditional territory of the Queen of Sheba, or Bilqis. You're in Saudi Arabia, you're in the Gulf states, and then going on to southern Iran. Zar has traveled through all of these different regions. And as I said, these traditions are all related to one another through this progression that happens with people living in one of these parts of the world where these traditions exists, wherein they will oftentimes find themselves being sickened, and they'll go through this progression, which I've already mentioned, which eventually will lead them to a czar healer, head of a Ganawa house, and the troupe of musicians. And in going through this possession based practice, the spirit will be, continuously worked with, at all these different levels that you mentioned, Svinga, the ancestral level, and this kind of like long standing exorcism that occurs. And eventually, if things continue on with this path, this person oftentimes becomes a figurehead within the traditions themselves, becomes a musician, ends up leading a house, ends up healing people themselves, ends up being a diviner or a wise person within this traditional context. So all of these traditions, whether it's Ganawa, Zar, they all have this broader story arc that occurs, which, as you mentioned at the beginning, is deeply tied into community, the non-human community as well as the human community, which is why I tend to emphasize it more than a lot of the ceremonial-based practices. So yes, it's important to mention not only this, what I'm calling the story arc or the spirit contact summary that happens with it, but also the fact that these traditions are intimately tied into the political circumstances of these regions, in particular to slavery, Black slavery. But even more than that, there's a great book called The Red Fez, which could add to the reading list. There's a performativity which, as long as you don't go with the full secular notion that is entirely performance, the performativity that comes with the spirit possession based traditions, wherein people are dressing up, there's food being served, the music, obviously, which we've been talking about. Oftentimes, the performativity is related to the particular cultural context and these different cultures that have moved through and come to be represented through these spirit-based practices. So many people might be familiar with the Afro-diasporic context, wherein take Umbanda, for example, and the notion of the Cigano peoples or the gypsies. There is there is a cultural understanding that is embedded within this possession-based practice, which Zar and Ganawa also hold on to. So in Zar, for example, there's a history in Egypt and Sudan of interaction with Turkey and with the Ottomans, in particular in the Ottoman Empire. So many of these spirits, in particular, if I remember correctly, the spirits who are tied to the water, are oftentimes connected to interactions with the Ottoman Empire as well as with European peoples. So these light-skinned, water-based jinn, Ahl al-Bahr, these spirits are tied in to the actual cultural interactions with the Ottoman Empire and with European people. So you can't talk about these traditions without talking about the very specific cultural context and political context that they emerge in. And the practitioners of these traditions, they would tell you just as much. So this, that when the spirits come down and possession occurs, this is the garb that they take, right? These are jinn, but they appear in the guise of an Ottoman Turk, right? Or of a fancy, well-dressed European person wearing like, lavish clothing and Nikes and this sort of stuff. Like,
I was just thinking about how similar that is to certain aspects of Maria Leonza in Venezuela and like the phalanx or the category of spirits that are Vikings led by Eric the Red, none other than him. And when they come down whipping themselves with chains and dressing as Vikings and being described in very like media-based tropes of what Vikings are supposed to look like. And I find that, yes, there's an element, I think the anthropologists tend to really look at the performance aspects of these things. I think it's also worth noting that just as we have ideas of what spirits look like and model them in our fashion and in our plays and in pop culture, spirits can have ideas of what we look like, especially when the way that they perceive us is not necessarily firstly through sight, but can be more through smell and so on, and the way that they are dazzled by certain things that we make, including jewelry. This comes up a lot sometimes in my own experiences with being around possession cults in various places. As spirits they can be asked like, why do you want this item? And their answer can be very fascinating in terms of it's not just necessarily because this is the aesthetic preference of, let's say, your culture to represent these peoples. It can be also like, well, this is what I'm representing for you to understand. This is my ability to travel anywhere is linked in your mind to peoples who are seafaring, and so I will dress as a seafarer so that you know that I can be in any place and I can give you information and knowledge and riches from other locations that you don't think, because of your idea of how fixed you are, I can in a flash be in a different country and be spying in the ears of the person that you're speaking to there and so on.
Exactly. And you get this with the color correspondences similarly as well, right? Which you also see in many of these same traditions. Another way that Jinn are broken down into different categories is through colors. So you'll oftentimes, and you hear this even in the ceremonial context with Melik al-Ahmar, or the king of the Jinn, who is the red king of Mars and of Tuesday. You get this in Zor and Qanawa as well, where the red spirits have this intensity of, this fiery intensity of character, and this is what they're good at. They're associated with, with the butchers and with bloodshed, frankly. And then, of course, you have the white Jinn in the ceremonial context. This is, Al-Abyad and the moon and Monday, and these spirits are related to cleanliness and purity, as well as typically to the saints of the particular area, whether it be Morocco, et cetera, et cetera. And then, the green spirits, and then the black spirits, and the black spirits tending to be of the Ghaba, of the forest and of the wilderness, and oftentimes a little bit more unruly. And of course, there are, racial stereotypes and all these kinds of things that are built into so many of these spirit contact systems as well. It's this funhouse mirror reflecting back and forth between, us, and then, as you said, Svinga, their response back to us, and it just keeps going back and forth, never ending.
100%. I'm really glad we had this discussion, because one of the things that always comes to my mind when I'm looking at sources, right, whether it's an immediate ethnographic resource, whether it's talking to someone from a particular tradition, whether it's academic texts, is always wondering, like, what is the angle, what is the context behind some of these motifs when we take them for granted and at face value versus kind of investigating some of their origins. We've mentioned quite a few different resources already, including traditions to look into for people who might be intrigued by this topic and want to know more. Is there any particular books or particular YouTube channels or podcasts or places for people that maybe, if they're interested in looking at not just Jinn necessarily as a category of phenomena in sort of the animistic spirit worlds in which we inhabit, but also the cultures that are living traditions that keep these very practices alive and transmitting to us, that we benefit from directly by reading secondhand and primary source literature from. I know you and Jay, have talked a lot about 1001 Nights as being such a phenomenal codex of Jinn lore that has influenced absolutely every part of the world that it's touched, and something that you grew up with yourself. Is what kind of, are there translations that you'd recommend, particular books people can look to, as well as other resources?
The Hadawi translation is my favorite because it doesn't use the more recent accretions may be a strong word, but many of the newer stories, like I mentioned, Aladdin, for example, I think even Sinbad the Sailor, that these were added in the 1800s, supposedly heard in Egypt and in the Middle East, but we don't know for sure. The Hadawi translation is mostly the older layer of these stories, and I think you can feel the difference between them. But in terms of, like, at some level, they are still pop culture for the time, and they're very not orthodox in that way. So like if you search the Jinn on YouTube, most of what you're going to get is the English speaking Orthodox Muslim take, which is mostly people in the diaspora, almost entirely men, if not 99% men, who all the information that they're going to talk about in relation to the Jinn is going to be from the Quran, which is fine. That the Quran, like we talked about, I think off the record, the Quran and the 1001 Nights, these are your two best sources, like through and through. So yeah, if you go down that route with YouTube, that's really the first thing that you're gonna get. But I've become increasingly interested in this pop cultural layer, which is not orthodox at all, which talks about love and romance and sexual relationships with between humans and jinn, as well as sorcery and magic and all the ways that are explicitly forbidden in any sort of orthodox context. And I'm also interested in the way these things interact with one another, this like on the ground thing, and then this very religious establishment thing. I think the Zar and in Okinawa and Bori and these different traditions, they're also somewhere in between on this spectrum. Just a few texts, for example, I reread recently Vincent Crapanzano's Hamadsha text, which is about a Sufi brotherhood called the Hamadsha, and they are not Renawa technically speaking, but there's many, many, many crossovers. And the Hamadsha Sufi brotherhood is thought to be particularly adept in all things having to do with Aisha Kandisha. And this is like their main jinn, let's say. And they're dealing with people who are possessed, who are ill, as well as the primary Sufi saint, whose name is escaping me right now. But Harpanzano's Hamadsha is a good one for Morocco. And there are others. I also encourage people to listen to that podcast I mentioned earlier, Saturnian Paradigms in North Africa, on my show. Spirits and Slaves in Central Sudan is my favorite Czar text by Susan Kenyon. I know we've also talked about Janice Body's Wombs and Alien Spirits, which I also like. I mentioned Barbara Drieskin's Living with the Jinn, which is based in Cairo. And another one that I think people might be interested in, which is also sort of like it's not so pop cultural that it's 1001 Nights, but it's not ultra philosophical religious, somewhere in between, is the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn. The Goodman McGregor, the Oxford translation, is the most well-known epistle of the Ikhwan al-Safa, Brotherhood of the Brethren of Purity, wherein animals go to the king of the jinn to bring a case against human beings for their treatment. One thing that we haven't really talked about much in this episode is the jinns frequently occurring in the bodies of animals, changing shape into animals, black dogs, snakes, cats, these kinds of beings that we would typically think of. So those are some book recommendations. To return back to like the pop cultural notion of jinn, recently there was a Tilda Swinton movie called 3,000 Years of Longing, which I actually thought wasn't so bad. Some of the Orientalism was a little heavy at times throughout the film, but I would say it's worth a watch if you haven't seen it. Obviously, people have seen like Disney movies, Aladdin with genies, and so many of our so people in the West, the way that they think about these things are based on that. Pier Paolo Pasolini's 1001 Nights is fabulous. I
Mhm.
recommend that to everyone who's into film. And then I would say everything that's happening on YouTube is also really, really interesting. And I would extend that to larger discussions that have been going on for more than a decade now, but especially since the internet has become more popular. And seeing the way that jinn have manifested, for example, on the internet, there's been academic papers discussing jinn, flowing through the electricity into chat rooms and, hitting people up in their tricksterish ways, as well as, as we've been talking about, jinn are everything that are not angels and humans. So UFOs and aliens, right? Like this is another thing you'll hear commenters and Muslim religious scholars oftentimes talk about about because they're seeing Western culture and the movies and everything else, the TV shows, and they're like, well, UFOs, this is Djinn as well, which, if you take the Jacques Vallée sort of stance on that, the fairies, we could say the same thing. They abduct people. This is another thing that I didn't mention that's just common to the Djinn, that taking away of people for, maybe even years at a time as they go to Mount Kof for the land of the Djinn, and sometimes they're perhaps never seen again. But yeah, the whole internet phenomena of the Djinn I find fascinating, and yeah, I know that a few of you have also seen things on YouTube and have some experiences with that. And as far as I'm concerned, this is folklore in the making.
100%. I remember just being shown videos of people not just making like tawiz for the purposes of like making an object move or something like that, but going on like almost ghost hunting adventure style videos to kind of
Mm.
origin phenomena. The chat room thing that you mentioned, Jay, is especially fascinating to me because I've seen even like you mentioned academic papers going into the idea of like a Djinn manifesting in the chat room, or even like old Yahoo groups and AOL forums, right, in which people were trying to like catalog Djinn phenomena. There's a huge subreddit on Reddit that's for Djinnology, and people looking for advice on how to deal with Djinn phenomena or summon them or follow them. And commenters, wondering like, is this person who's speaking to me right now and replying to my text, a Djinn, and not just necessarily in the sense of like possessing someone a type, but like quite literally being in the internet, in the airwaves, as it were.
Yeah, I love it. It's so good. The way these things shape and form with culture, with the influence of American culture and all of this sort of stuff. I find it fascinating.
Do you have a personal like favorite internet phenomenon that you've discovered with Jin?
Well, this was just yesterday. The YouTube short phenomena is interesting because they're meant to just catch people's attention very readily for all those who don't want to sit and watch a whole episode of something. But because I knew we were going to do this episode, I hadn't checked in on what's been happening with Jin on YouTube as of late. And I think pretty much the first short that I saw, it was a guy in I think the Gulf, maybe it was like Qatar or something, and he's like about to walk into a cave. It's had like millions of views on it. He's about to walk into a cave, and he's like "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim," and he's like Bismillah, 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 walks into this cave, and there's like a black hooded or black cloaked like being in the corner, kind of like screeching randomly. And he goes, have you seen this one? he
Yeah,
goes
yeah, I've
he
seen it.
goes to zoom in on it, and it's like this weird little head on a stick, and you can see the hand moving the stick with this little head on top of it, and it's like
I know exactly what you're talking about. I was looking at some of the shorts as well, like Jin caught on camera, real life Jin on camera, and that one had me like in tears of just like the
I
hook.
was dying.
We
Yeah.
Mhm.
found guy in the cave. I'll link that in the show notes for the Patreons. That was
Cool.
signs there's a Jin in your house and do these things, like there's all these like tips, and you get like you said, like the orthodox presentation of like, well, here's what you do and here's how to avoid it, but you get like some people who just kind of like go out and try and like really like track it down and find it, and you get these like little YouTube ghost hunter events that I think are just so quaint and
Mhm.
fascinating, especially when they're put on like that.
Another pop cultural thing that I find really funny with all the Jin videos, and you get it with the same group of people who post the Orthodox Muslim stuff, is they take like so many clips from American horror movies, like the Grudge and The Exorcist, and every time that they mention a Jin or like an encounter with they'll just like flash a picture from like a scene from The Exorcist or something of like, the little girl with her head spinning around and her
Yeah,
eyeballs
yeah,
going
yeah.
backwards. And like, I just fucking love it. I don't know why. It's so good to me, the like the melding of these worlds.
100%. It's funny just even looking at like a whole genre of horror films coming out of Indonesia, for example, that are just about like jinn possession and like becoming
Mhm.
this huge like phenomenon for like pop cultural horror. I think it's absolutely fascinating. But yeah, the cave investigation videos, I think their own subsection because like they always have like an interesting puppet in the end. And then there's the ones that are actually like I love all like the emoji spam where it's just like pointing emoji, fear emoji, sobbing emoji, like ya Allah, real Jinn encounter, hashtag, Jinn encounter or something
The
like that.
the deep fried, drawing a circle around the most egregious poltergeist activity you've ever seen in your entire life, and being like seductively even Bismillah is a very important addition to this particular phenomena.
I love a good deep Bismillah.
Mm.
Bismillah. I absolutely adore it. Another thing that I will say is I love the like the ta'weez or the the amulet, the juju finding expedition videos on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
You get this a lot in the Gulf states, like Saudi witchcraft police find this and that thing, as well as like these different talk shows that exist where the sheikh or the the Muslim wise person or the raqi, the healer, the Quranic healer will like bring the little amulets and ta'weez and little like voodoo doll equivalent things onto the show and like pin the needle on the doll and everything. He's like, there's one that I saw the other day. He was like, no, I canceled it. I canceled it. And the host of the show was like, is that still active? Is all this stuff you brought still active? He's like, no, I canceled it. So good.
I've seen some
Uh,
Caribbean shows that are just like that. It's funny how some things never change, where like you have the person who's the investigator exorcist who's talking about like Vlach magic or something like that, or sihir, or various different forms of like what is considered to be like the ultimate black magic in our culture, and then being like, well, you put the you lick these particular names off a parchment, or you submerge them in water and then you drink the water and it cleanses you, or you put the alphabet, literally just the Cyrillic alphabet, you carve it in dough, and when the bread rises, you eat one letter a day, and that will cure you of the possession or whatever it is. And then they bring them on a talk show, and it's the same kind of thing in terms of like bringing these props and what they found and buried in someone's wall or on their property. I find the Tawiz stuff especially fascinating because, fun fact, like when I moved into the current home in which I live, I literally felt like one of those guys because I actually found a tawiz that was for protection that the former tenant who was from Afghanistan had left. And it was literally under the bed. And I was like, what is this? Because to me, not being very experienced and being able to differentiate them, I was like, I want to know what this is for. And I ran it by a friend who is Arabic and who's able to be like, this is for protection, like you're fine, and taught me how to like remove it and so on. But it was definitely like I felt like I had my YouTube moment and having like literally found something like a protection amulet. But
you didn't do a big reveal. You didn't do a big reveal YouTube episode.
oh, I could have. And that's one of those things too, is like I think God help whoever moves into this place after me with what I've buried in the soil and put in the walls.
Mhm.
Oh.
So they
Oh.
can they can do a much better reveal than I would because that
Uh,
I just one thing, they'll find 7,000.
I just want to say I know we're winding down because we're talking about pop culture type stuff, and I brought up horror movies. There are, and as you said, Svinga, I'm seeing more and more Jinn horror movies that are not English speaking ones either, which is great. I love that. I think it overplays the Jinn as scary beings a little bit too much, but I'm a fan. But I will say my favorite horror movie that is Jinn related is called Under the Shadow by the director Babak Anbari. I also wrote an article referencing that you can find on my Patreon, in particular because in this film it speaks about the Jinn riding the missiles in the wind in the Iran-Iraq war. I found this idea really, really fascinating because once again, the jinn are oftentimes referred to as ruh or the wind, and in their ability to destroy or to wreak havoc. And so, in the context of a war, this notion of them, riding missiles from one country to the other in this act of destruction, I find really, really fascinating. And yeah, if you haven't seen Under the Shadow, I think it might still be on Netflix. Been on Netflix forever, but that's my favorite Jinn horror movie.
100%. Actually, a friend of mine recommended the Turkish horror film series Dabi Possession, which involves like jinn and so on. There's also, I've seen 3000 Years of Longing. I live streamed it for Key. The two of us watched it
Mm.
together one night. I'm trying to think. Oh yes, there's a French film actually called Kandisha, which is about Aisha Kandisha. It's on Shudder, which is a little corny but kind of cute. There's a lot of it. I think it's very worth investigating how these kinds of tropes play out in mass media, especially as we mentioned with Fairy and with Jin alike, right? Huge influence on pop culture, and some say deliberately so, in terms of the way that they influence fashion and music, and the way that trance and mania and ecstasy, which is states completely familiar to artists as well as spiritualists, is going to be intertwined with spirit influence.
Well said. Well said.
Well, I thank you so much, Jay. This has been an absolute pleasure. You are a wealth of knowledge, and I'm so delighted that you were on to help us pierce through a very complicated and nuanced topic with such grace, precision, and evidently extreme erudition. Your deep studies, and especially the deep way that you've thought about the subject, not just through reading papers and doing personal investigation, but just through the ways in which you connect to this and understand, and the cross-cultural links of what it means to live in an animist worldview that is not necessarily just based on analyzing everything purely through the lens of performance. And not to say that performance isn't important, but more to say that, like, if all things are performance, then we have to acknowledge as well as animists that spirits perform as well. And so looking at their performance and not just purely human derived, I think is something that you're absolutely done with such great precision and sagacity. Thank you so, so much. I am absolutely delighted. Everyone, please do check out Jay's work at starnightdwell.com. He has an amazing podcast. The episodes that you've mentioned are phenomenal, but so are all of them. Please do check out his entire catalog. He's available as Starnight Dwell on Instagram, on Twitter, and check out the Son of Knowledge, the Shams al-Marif, on Reveler.press. That's his publication of some of the selections from the Shams. And he's got a wonderful class coming out with the Salem Witchcraft Festival, Magic of 1001 Nights. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug as well?
There's a Lunar Mansions book coming out with
Oh, yes.
Revelor Press. Same press as the Shams al-Ma'arif in April. The book has been officially announced by the publisher, so I can say. But this is the Lunar Mansion book that I've been working on for about 3 years now. And I'm really, really excited to bring this to everyone. So the book is divided up into two parts. The second part being what you would typically encounter in an astrology book, where it talks about, the different images and plants and magic and delineations related to the 28 lunar mansions or stations. But the first part is loosely based on the 1001 nights. So it takes each lunar mansion as a night. So 28 nights, if you will, in dream logic, story, narrative, poetry format, which is Procession of the Night Theater, an exposition on the lunar stations, excuse me. So be on the lookout for that with Revelor Press. It's not entirely unrelated to what we've been talking about tonight.
I'm so beyond excited about that. Salt and I have literally been talking about the just like counting down the days until we're able to have it in our hands.
Getting on that
Definitely,
hype
yeah.
train.
Hype train.
Hell yeah.
And we hope to have you back for a Lunar Mansion scene
Yes.
closer to the launch of the book.
Yes. 4 hours. 4 hours on the Frightful Howls.
Let's go. Hell yeah. Amazing. And our Akashic Records, you already started off the episode with so many great suggestions. I'm looking forward to plugging all of them into our Spotify playlist, the ones that are available on Spotify, at least for those who are subscribed to the ever expanding Akashic Records, pun intended fully, of the Frightful Howls. Any other songs we should plug? Good old Nawa Records for our listeners.
Hamid Al Qasri, Aisha Hamdushia.
Mhm.
That is that's such a banger. God, if you're not moving to that one, that one's dangerous. That's like spirit possession through the internet or through the speakers. Be careful with that one. But Hamid Al-Qasri, he has really, really great YouTube videos as well for the Ghanawa group, where they're all beautifully dressed and they're in lavish rooms with carpets and cowrie shells, and it's fabulous. So he's a contemporary Ghanawa musician. So basically everything that he's doing is amazing.
And remember in the beginning episode, right, we have Najat al-Shiraz, Ana Bashar al-Bahar, Omar Farouk Tekbilek, the Sultan of the Heart, and Amr Diab's Nur al-Ain, which are absolute bangers. And you were the one to suggest a License to Depart. Speaking of a banger, this is one of the because we were talking about this beforehand. We were like, it's so short but so good. Like I could incorporate this into like 100 contexts just off the top of my head. Like it's absolutely beautiful. Would you like to introduce the Al-Falaq?
Yeah, so Surat al-Falaq is the 113th surah of the Quran. It translates to the dawn or the daybreak, and it's a typical quick charm that Muslims use to keep the evil eye away, primarily, is really what it's best for, to keep just general witchcraft and people working against you away, but also good apotropaic against Djinn and the like. So I figure as an ending of the episode to bring in the dawn of the day, because we are staying up into the wee hours having this conversation. I figured I'd do the ending of the show for Surat al-Falaq, which I'll give you the Arabic first, and then I'll give the English translation after. So
Beautiful.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Kul ayuzu bi rabbil falaq min shari ma khalaq. ومن شر غاسق إذا وقب ومن شر النفاثات في العقد ومن شر حاسد إذا حسد. So this translates to Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. I seek refuge in the Lord of the dawn, from the evil which is created, and from the evil of darkness when it settles, and from the evil of those who blow on knots, which is my favorite part, and from the evil of an envier when he envies, which is the best part in protection against the evil eye, in particular, the last line. So I figured that'd be a good way for us to go out.
Absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Jerry.
My pleasure. Masalam. Take care, everyone.